Just a nurse. That's what they whispered when Katie Morrison moved through Sacred Heart's corridors at 6:06 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in San Diego. They didn't know that beneath her faded scrubs, tucked against her sternum on a chain she'd deliberately never repaired, hung a single dog tag made from shrapnel salvaged from a compound in Ramadi, the kind of talisman that only exists when a classified operation ends in blood and official silence. They didn't know that the woman who smiled politely at their jokes and deferred to every attending physician had once commanded 214 Marines through 2 kilometers of hostile territory while calling in air support with the calm of someone ordering groceries. The Pentagon had erased her 13 years ago. Officially, Major Katie Morrison ceased to exist the moment the extraction helicopter lifted off from FOB Shank. What happened next didn't just change her life, it changed everything. The emergency department hummed with its usual 7 a.m. rhythm. Banks of monitors beeped their lazy metronome, punctuated by the urgent wheeze of ventilators in the trauma bays and the rhythmic hiss of automated blood pressure cuffs cycling through their readings. Katie moved through it all like water, economical, present, invisible. Her sneakers, white New Balance with scuffed sides from 6 years of 12-hour shifts, made no sound on the linoleum. She'd learned that in Ramadi. Quiet movement meant you stayed off people's radar. Quiet movement meant survival. The antiseptic smell of the ICU gave way to the sharper tang of fresh coffee as she approached the nurse's station. The break room coffee was 3 hours old and tasted like burnt regret, so she'd started stopping at the cafe on Harbor Drive before her shifts. Small indulgence. Small normalcy. The kind of thing civilians did without thinking. Katie had learned to think about everything. "Morrison, you're in Bay 3 this morning," said Derek, the charge nurse, barely glancing up from the assignment board. He was good people, former Army Reserve, never asked questions about her occasional 1,000-yard stare, understood without explanation why she kept her back against walls and her exits mapped. Routine lacerations and contusions. Should be quiet. Quiet was good. Quiet meant time to think. Quiet meant no emergencies, no crisis decisions, no moments when her hands moved on their own and her voice dropped 3 octaves and civilians froze because they suddenly recognized something predatory standing in scrubs. Katie nodded, already moving toward her assigned bay. Her fingers instinctively checked the position of the broken dog tag through the fabric of her top, still there, still secure, still a reminder of everything the world was not supposed to know about her. The chain had snapped on the extraction helicopter 13 years ago, sheared clean by shrapnel when the rotor wash kicked up a piece of the compound wall. She'd picked it up off the tarmac and never had it repaired. Some brakes were meant to stay broken. Some chains were meant to remain severed. The morning stretched out with the predictable rhythm of a Monday masquerading as a Tuesday. A construction worker with a 6-inch gash along his forearm from a circular saw, Katie assessed the damage immediately. Laceration to the subcutaneous layer, no arterial involvement, no nerve damage based on his ability to flex and feel. She could do this in her sleep. She had done harder things in far worse conditions. "This is going to need stitches," she told the worker, whose name was Tom and who'd been talking about his daughter's soccer tournament. She kept her voice soft, deferential, the voice of someone apologizing for an inconvenience rather than someone who once held a tourniquet on a sergeant with a compound fracture while round snapped past her ear. "I'm going to clean this, and then Dr. Caldwell will come in and—" "You can handle it, right?" Tom interrupted, his voice casual, his confidence in her obvious and entirely unwarranted from his perspective. He had no idea who was standing over his arm. No idea that her hands had held lives together in conditions that would have broken most people. Katie hesitated for exactly 1 second. Protocol said that wound closure required physician approval. Protocol said she was just a nurse. Protocol said many things that were technically true and deeply insufficient for reality. "I can handle it," she said quietly, and reached for the suture kit. The work was automatic. Methodical. She cleansed the wound with 0.9% saline solution, the liquid clear and cold and precise, washing away the dried blood and loose tissue. The fluorescent lights above threw everything into high-definition clarity, blood vessels like threads, connective tissue pale and honest. She'd never understood why civilians flinched from their own body's architecture. The human body was a remarkable machine. Fragile in some ways, impossibly resilient in others. Her fingers moved with the economy of someone who'd done this exact motion thousands of times. Needle through skin. Knot. Cat. Advance. The suture material, Photo-Zero nylon, standard closure for forearm lacerations, passed through her fingers like prayer beads. 12 stitches, each one placed with the same precision she once used to field dress a gunshot wound by moonlight with only a knife and determination. "Jesus, you're good at this," Tom said, watching her work. It was then that she heard the footsteps. Click. 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 Expensive shoes on linoleum. The rhythm was wrong, not the shuffle of a tired nurse or the measured pace of a physician making rounds, but something staccato and proprietary. The footsteps of someone who owned the space they moved through. Dr. James Caldwell appeared in the bay doorway like a man had finally arrived where he belonged. He was 48, Katie guessed, with the kind of lean muscle that came from private gyms and inherited confidence. His suit was tailored, probably cost more than her monthly rent. His tie was silk. His watch was a Rolex, the kind that men wore to announce something about themselves that had nothing to do with telling time. He stopped in the doorway and watched her work, his expression shifting from proprietary physician overseeing his domain to something sharper, something colder, something that felt like recognition. Katie didn't look up. She completed the final suture, cut the thread, and set the instruments down on the sterile field with a kind of precision that left nothing to interpretation. "Tom, this is Dr. Caldwell, our new attending," she said softly, stepping back from the bedside with her hands already moving toward the biohazard container. "He's going to review my work and make sure everything's appropriate." The words tasted like ash. My work. As if she needed permission to be competent. As if her hands needed validation from someone with a better resume. Caldwell stepped forward and examined the sutures. His gaze lingered on each one. His jaw moved slightly, processing what he was seeing. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were a flat grey-blue that reminded Katie of winter sky over water, cold, reflective, revealing nothing. "These are very precise," he said quietly. There was something in his tone that wasn't quite a compliment. It sounded more like a question posed in statement form. Almost surgical. "Thank you, Dr. Caldwell," Katie said, keeping her voice at the same pitch, maintaining the same deferential posture that had protected her for 13 years. The posture of someone who was not dangerous. Someone who was not worth watching closely. Someone who was just a nurse, nothing more, nothing threatening. But something in Caldwell's eyes shifted. He wasn't done looking at her. He wasn't done processing. The morning continued. A woman with a contused knee from a fall in a parking garage. A teenage boy with a laceration on his chin that required 5 stitches. Katie moved through each patient with the same quiet efficiency. Suture by suture, wound by wound. The work was grounding. The work was real. The work kept her alive in a way that went beyond mere biological function. It was 9:23 a.m. when the emergency doors burst open. The radio had been crackling all morning with routine ambulance traffic, a vehicle collision on IR-5, a possible overdose in downtown San Diego, a fall from a construction site that turned out to be minor. Katie had stopped tracking the announcements after the first hour. Emergencies had a rhythm, and Mondays were usually quiet. But this sound was different. This was the sound of purpose. This was the sound of urgency that had teeth. 2 paramedics were running. Not jogging. Running. The stretcher between them moved like it was alive, and the man on it was hemorrhaging. "We have a training accident victim, 23-year-old male, estimated blood loss 2 liters, femoral artery laceration, vitals are crashing," the paramedic said as they burst through the bay entrance. His voice was professional but tight. "ETA Trauma 1 was for minutes ago, we upgraded to critical en route." Katie moved without thinking. The machinery of emergency response was automatic now. She was already scanning his vitals, already reading the color of his skin, the positioning of his body, the way his breathing was shallow and panicked. Pale. Clammy. The kind of white that meant shock, meant his body was already dying, meant they had minutes, not longer. Bay 2. Let's move. Dr. Caldwell's voice cut through the controlled chaos. He was already moving toward the trauma bay, his expensive shoes clicking faster now, his surgeon's mind engaging despite his designer suit. But Katie was already there. She was already pulling on gloves, fresh blue nitrile, the latex-free kind, because she'd learned in the first week that allergies didn't care about your preferences, and her mind was already 3 steps ahead. Femoral artery meant leg trauma, meant vascular emergency, meant this kid was going to die without intervention. The training accident detail registered somewhere in her peripheral processing. Camp Pendleton. Marine. Paratrooper, probably. The paramedic slid him onto the trauma bay bed, and Katie saw the wound, the upper left thigh, a gaping laceration that was still bleeding despite the tourniquet they'd applied at roughly mid-thigh. The tourniquet was too loose. She could see it immediately. She didn't say anything. She simply moved to the adjacent supply cabinet and pulled it tighter herself, feeling the resistance of muscle and bone, feeling the pulse below it disappear. Good. He had maybe 2 minutes of tissue viability below the tourniquet before necrosis started. They had maybe 10 minutes to get that femoral artery repaired before his entire leg started dying. Maybe 15 if they were lucky. Type and crossmatch, full workup, let's get 2 liters of O-negative running, Caldwell said, his hands already moving, his voice already shifting into the cadence of command that physicians used in emergencies. Call up to OR, tell them we need an open femoral repair, tell them I'm coming up in 5 minutes. The monitor was screaming. The young man's blood pressure was 67/41. His oxygen saturation was dropping. His heart rate was climbing, 156, 168, 172 beats per minute, the electrical system of his heart trying to compensate for blood it no longer had enough of. I have O-negative available, Katie said quietly. And then, with absolute certainty, I can donate. It wasn't a question. It wasn't something she was asking permission for. She was already rolling up her sleeve, already knowing her blood type, already understanding that this kid, this paratrooper from Camp Pendleton, was dying and she had a solution that would work. Caldwell's hands froze for a microsecond. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, something registered on his face. Something that looked like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. Not just the competence of her sutures, but something else. The way she'd moved. The way she'd commanded the space. The way her voice had dropped 3 syllables when she'd given orders that the trauma nurses had obeyed without question. That's not standard protocol, he said, but he was already nodding at the lab tech who was pulling Katie's arm toward the donation needle. But I'm not going to argue about type O-negative right now. The needle slid into her vein, she didn't flinch, and her blood began draining into a bag. Warm. Still hers. Still carrying oxygen to every cell of her body until it left her veins and flowed toward a stranger who needed it more than she did. She'd done this before. Not with a needle in a hospital, but with tourniquets and duct tape and pressure bandages, giving blood that way, stopping her own bleeding so that someone else could keep breathing. The mechanics were the same. The calculus was the same. Human beings came first. Everything else was strategy. The paratrooper's blood pressure was climbing. 73/45. Not great, but better. The transfusion was working. Katie's blood, her rare type O-negative, the universal donor, the kind of blood that could save anyone without matching, was doing its job. She watched Caldwell move toward the OR, already mentally preparing for the open repair he'd have to do on that femoral artery. She watched the trauma nurses move in synchronous motion, having found their rhythm, her orders still echoing in their movements. And she watched the color slowly return to the paratrooper's face as her blood flowed into his veins. It wasn't until the donation needle came out and she held a gauze pad against the small puncture wound that Katie noticed Dr. Caldwell had stopped at the bay entrance. He was looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It looked almost like recognition. Or perhaps like he was trying to solve a problem. He'd seen her work. He'd seen her command without speaking. He'd seen something that didn't match the narrative of the quiet nurse who deferred to physicians and kept her head down. The question was whether he would ask questions about what he'd seen, or whether he would do what everyone did. Move on. Assume his own interpretation. Decide that the woman in the scrubs was simply good at her job. Katie pressed the gauze against her arm and said nothing. She'd been invisible before. She'd become invisible again. But something had changed in the room. Something Caldwell had seen. And the way he'd paused at the doorway, the way his expensive shoes had hesitated on the linoleum, it suggested that his curiosity was not yet satisfied. Morning rounds at Sacred Heart moved with the precision of a military formation, except nobody knew they were being led by someone who'd actually commanded one. Dr. Caldwell stood at the center of the cluster, residents, interns, nursing staff orbiting his expensive shoes like planets around a sun that had decided it was better than everyone else. Katie moved through the rhythm of vitals and charts, her voice pitched low, her observations clinical and precise. She'd learned long ago that competence whispered louder than ambition ever shouted. They stopped at bed 7. Trauma from yesterday, 63-year-old male, post-op abdominal. Temperature climbing. Heart rate elevated. Katie had been watching the numbers drift upward since the 6 a.m. handoff, had noticed the way his skin had taken on that particular grey-white pallor that meant something was rotating wrong inside his body. The sepsis wasn't announced yet by any single dramatic symptom, it was written in the small things. The breathing pattern. The way his lips had lost their color. The subtle shift in his mental status when she'd asked him to squeeze her hand. She spoke quietly, her voice steady, elevated lactate from last labs. Temperature's been trending since 0400. I'd suggest we check for perforated viscous, possibly bacterial translocation from the anastomosis site. Needs imaging before. Nurse Morrison. Caldwell's voice cut through hers like a scalpel through silk. He didn't raise his volume. Didn't need to. Perhaps you'd like to attend medical school before practicing medicine in my ER. The residents laughed. Quick, nervous laughter. The kind that came from understanding the power dynamic in the room and choosing to align with it. Katie absorbed the words like a combat medic absorbs incoming fire, without flinching, without the luxury of reaction. She breathed once, steady and measured. Her eyes remained on her clipboard. The tightening around her eyes would only show to someone who'd learned to read the small signals of restraint, the micro-movements that happened when someone had spent years training their face to stay neutral while being systematically disrespected. Understood, doctor, she said quietly. But the patient coded at 9:36 a.m. Septic shock. Perforated anastomosis, exactly where Katie had predicted. Caldwell ran the code himself, and she watched from the periphery as he ordered antibiotics, imaging, emergency surgical consult. The patient stabilized. He lived. And Caldwell's eyes never once met hers, never once acknowledged that her whispered differential had been correct. That was when the nickname started. Florence. As in Florence Nightingale. As in a relic, a historical figure, someone whose era had passed and whose knowledge was decorative rather than essential. He used it constantly now, in front of other staff, in front of residents. Florence thinks she's found something interesting spoken with the tone someone might use to describe a child's drawing on a refrigerator. Florence has ideas above her station delivered to the nursing director with a smile that made it clear he was being generous, patient, almost amused by her presumption. The break room smelled like institutional coffee and the particular staleness of a space where fluorescent lights had been humming for 18 hours. Katie pushed through the double doors on day 4 with her lunch container, already knowing what would happen. Conversation stopped. Not gradually. Not naturally. Stopped the way a siren stops when someone flips a switch. 3 nurses looked at her, looked at each other, and suddenly remembered urgent tasks elsewhere. One grabbed her phone. Another checked her watch. A third busied herself with the refrigerator, opening and closing it without removing anything. The whiteboard visible through the doorway had the week's schedule, notes about staffing, and, new today, a section marked in red, disciplinary review, overstepping scope of practice. Katie sat down at the empty table, opened her container, and ate. The fluorescent light above her head buzzed at a frequency that seemed designed specifically to prevent thought. Nobody joined her. Nobody spoke to her. By the time she finished, the break room had cleared entirely, and she was alone with the sound of the ventilation system and the whiteboard in the adjacent hallway that might as well have had her name written across it in blood. It was the public posting that crossed something final. Katie's full name, handwritten in Caldwell's precise script on the disciplinary board outside the nursing station, the one visible to patients, families, visiting physicians, maintenance staff, anyone who happened to walk through that corridor. Katie Morrison, disciplinary review, insubordination. 0614. She read it on her way to the supply room at 14:32. The hallway was empty except for Caldwell himself, standing near the main desk as if he'd been waiting. Maybe he had. 3 strikes and you're out, Florence. His voice was pitched to carry, and the residents nearby heard every word. I'm watching you. Very carefully. Katie stopped. Turned. Faced him in the corridor between the fluorescent panels and the sterile tile and the whiteboard that announced her censure to the world. Her eyes met his. One tear escaped, just one, not from fear or pain but from the absolute precision of her restraint, from the effort of standing still while someone who'd never seen actual combat told her who she was. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. I've been watched by people who actually scared me, Doctor. Her voice was quiet, conversational, steady as a surgeon's hand during a critical procedure. People who could end you with a phone call to the Pentagon. You're not one of them. The words landed like decompression. The corridor went absolutely silent. The resident stared. Caldwell's face drained of color for exactly 2 seconds before he recovered, before he manufactured indignation and walked away, but Katie had seen it, that flicker of recognition, that instant where he understood he'd said something to someone who wasn't actually frightened of him. That would haunt him. What happened next changed the entire trajectory of Sacred Heart's afternoon. The ambulance screamed into the bay at 15:04 with a trauma that made everything else fade. Specialized Marcus Chen, 23, from Camp Pendleton, his left leg wrapped in field tourniquets, blood pressure already diving despite the 2-4s that the paramedics had burned trying to establish. His eyes were the color of someone's last hope. Katie was the charge nurse. She moved before anyone else registered the level of damage, before the ER team had even fully assembled. O negative, type and cross for 6, get me a vascular tray, a move, move, move. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Her voice had dropped an octave, had taken on the cadence of someone who'd issued orders under mortar fire. The trauma team responded as if she was senior. Because something in her voice made it clear she was, had been, was still, would always be. Caldwell watched from the edge of the bay. He watched the way she positioned the gurney for optimal light. The way she didn't ask the residents to help, she positioned them, directed them, orchestrated the space like someone who'd learned that clarity under pressure was the only thing that separated survival from a body bag. He watched her secure the airway with movements so economical they seemed choreographed, and he watched her pupils stay absolutely focused while she rattled off vitals in that strange, precise cadence, BP 74/42 and falling, heart rate 148, resp 18, O2 sat 86 on high flow. Then the blood bank called. AB negative. The rarest type. 40 minutes out, minimum. Katie extended her arm without hesitation, her sleeves already rolled, her movements showing no hesitation, no doubt. I'm AB negative. Use me. She gave blood while managing the resuscitation, her left hand steady on the 4 while her right continued the secondary survey, while her voice continued the quiet stream of information that kept the team moving. Caldwell watched her pupils stay fixed, her breathing controlled, her hands moving with the absolute precision of someone who'd done this before, actually done this, not studied it, not theorized about it, but lived it. Something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition flickered like a pilot light finding fuel. Threat assessment. And when Chen stabilized and Katie returned to documentation, her arm still marked with the puncture where they'd drawn her blood, Caldwell made his first phone call to hospital administration. Quiet. Professional. Requesting a routine review of her credentials and background. Nothing official yet. Just precaution. But the machinery had started turning. That evening her schedule changed. The next morning her access badge didn't open the ICU doors. By the end of the shift, she'd heard Caldwell mentioning to the nursing director that there were concerning gaps in Morrison's employment history that required investigation before she could be trusted with critical patients. The room went dead silent when he said it. And Katie understood, he was just beginning. Friday night at Sacred Heart hit like a breach charge through the ER doors. 11 gunshot victims. Gang retaliation on 32nd Street, the dispatch call said, a drive-by that turned a street corner into a war zone. Katie heard the sirens before the paramedics wheeled through, 3 ambulances screaming up to the bay in sequence, each one bleeding into the next until the waiting room smelled like copper and diesel exhaust. The first 2 came in stable. The third didn't. Paramedic Chen was riding the stretcher, doing chest compressions on a kid who couldn't have been more than 16. Dark curly hair matted with blood. A Chargers jersey hanging off one shoulder, the front punched through with a 2-inch hole that went clean through. Entry and exit. That meant shrapnel. That meant damage nobody could calculate on wheels. 16-year-old male, David Reyes, through and through anterior chest wound at the left hemithorax, Chen called out, his compression steady and mechanical. Vitals tanking. BP was 110/60 in the field 5 minutes ago. Now it's 78/48. We've got 2 large bore access lines running, pushing O negative, but he's losing it faster than we can replace it. Katie moved with the stretcher, her gloved hands already reaching for the monitoring cables. The boy's skin was the color of wet concrete. His eyes rolled back, unfocused, the whites showing. The monitors screamed their urgent song, heart rate climbing toward 160, oxygen sat dropping toward 78, systolic pressure hemorrhaging away like sand through an hourglass. Airway, she asked. Intubated in the field, Chen said. Tubes in good position. But look at his neck veins. Distended. And his breath sounds are absent on the left side. Pericardial tamponade. The blood wasn't just in his chest cavity, it was compressing his heart. His heart was drowning in its own fluid while the chambers collapsed like a fist closing. 3 minutes. Maybe less. Dr. Caldwell arrived as they wheeled into Trauma Bay 4, and his entrance carried the weight of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. Tall. 50-something. Wearing the kind of confidence that came from 20 years of being right and never once having to apologize for it. His eyes swept the monitors once, twice, and settled on David's face with the calm calculation of a man pricing a piece of furniture he wasn't sure he wanted to buy. Notify cardiac surgery at Scripps. I want him transferred, full NICU setup, level 1 protocols. Caldwell's voice was smooth. Practiced. The voice of someone who'd made 100 decisions like this and slept perfectly fine afterward. Sir, his vitals, Katie began, are critical. Exactly why he needs a surgical suite, not a trauma bay. Caldwell was already moving past her, his body language a closed door. EMS has 20 minutes to Scripps. We stabilize and transfer. That's protocol. Katie watched the monitors flicker. BP dropping. 72, 68. The oxygen sat reached 74 and started its descent into numbers that meant brain damage, that meant every second he didn't have a functioning heart was a second of neurons dying, synapses fading, the person David Reyes might have been getting erased 1 cell at a time. He won't make the elevator, Katie said. Caldwell turned. His eyes found hers, and there was something in them that wasn't anger yet, something colder. Something that looked like recognition. Excuse me. His pericardium is full. His heart's tamponading. He's losing pressure and gaining fluid. Blood pressure keeps dropping like this, he goes into cardiac arrest before the doors close. Katie's voice stayed level. Flat. The voice of someone stating facts, not opinions. He needs a needle decompression at minimum. Field thoracotomy is better. Caldwell's jawline tightened. A field thoracotomy in a trauma bay. Do you understand what you're asking for? The complications, the liability, the fact that we have a trauma center 5 miles away where the proper surgeons can actually manage this. The proper surgeons will find a corpse, Katie said. The room shifted. Nurses stopped moving. Respiratory tech Marcus, who'd been adjusting the ventilator, froze with his hand still raised. The beeping of machines suddenly sounded louder, each pulse a countdown. Nurse Morrison. Caldwell's voice dropped. Not quiet, controlled. The way a predator sounds when it's about to decide whether you're worth eating. That procedure is not performed in this hospital without a cardiac surgeon present. The liability exposure alone would. He'll be dead in 2 minutes, Katie interrupted. The liability of letting him die because protocol said so will look great in the deposition. Caldwell's face flushed a color that started white and moved through crimson. He opened his mouth. Closed it. When he spoke again, his voice had the edge of someone who'd just realized he was being challenged in front of an audience. You are explicitly ordered not to touch this patient. Security. He didn't even look around for them. Just said the word like he was ordering room service. Remove Nurse Morrison from this trauma bay. Now. The monitors beat their urgent song. 65, 62. David's pupils dilated further. In the hallway, his mother's voice broke like glass, a sound raw enough to crack stone, a sound that knew what was happening even though she didn't have the medical vocabulary for it. Katie looked at Dr. Caldwell. Looked at the boy whose chest was filling with blood. Looked at the clock on the wall that said 11:19 p.m. and felt something in her settle into the place it had learned to live years ago, in a compound in Ramadi where following orders meant watching people die and disobeying orders meant becoming a ghost. She grabbed a sterile surgical tray. The scalpel came up like it had never been put down, muscle memory routing through her hands before her brain could catch up. She cracked the boy's chest open with one smooth horizontal incision across the fourth intercostal space, and the precision of it, the way her hands knew exactly how deep to go, where the ribs were, how to avoid the pleura, made Dr. Caldwell's face go absolutely blank. The blood came out. Dark red. Pressurized. Katie's bare hands reached into the chest cavity, found the bleeding, and clamped it. Felt the heart beneath her fingers, erratic, struggling, fighting. Her voice dropped into a cadence she hadn't used in 8 years, a voice that had talked dying Rangers through their last moments in a phi base that didn't exist on any official map. David, stay with me. You're doing great. I've got you. Stay with me. The boy's pupils tracked toward her voice. Found her face. Keep breathing. I know it hurts. Pain is data. It means you're alive. Keep breathing. His oxygen sat started climbing. 76, 79. 81, the heart rate steadied under her hands, the rhythm becoming something that resembled life instead of drowning. A cardiac surgeon arrived 17 minutes later, Dr. Khalil, 40 years old, scarred hands that had been doing this longer than Katie had been pretending to be just a nurse. He took one look at the field thoracotomy Katie had performed and went absolutely still. That's textbook field trauma surgery, he said quietly. Perfect intercostal approach. Clean clamping. Who did this? Caldwell didn't answer. His face had gone very still, the kind of still that comes right before a predator decides what it's going to do with prey it just realized might have teeth. Katie was already stepping back, her gloved hands dripping, her scrubs dark with blood. The boy was still breathing. His heart was still beating. The machines kept their mechanical rhythm, and in that rhythm was life, real, fragile, still possible life. Caldwell watched her hands as she stripped the gloves. Watched her face as she moved to the corner of the bay, where his view was clear and absolute. And in his eyes was something that had shifted from anger to something far more dangerous. Recognition. The kind of recognition that came when a predator realized it had been hunting prey that had been hunting in the same territory for far longer, and had simply chosen not to hunt back until the moment survival demanded it. Until the moment the mast slipped and the thing underneath showed its teeth. Katie felt his eyes on her as Khalil took over the thoracotomy, as the boy was wheeled up to the OR, as the machines sang their recovery song in the bay that smelled like copper and antiseptic and something else now, something that smelled like consequences finally coming due. The night shift continued. 3 more gunshot victims came through. 1 didn't make it. 1 was touch and go. The 3rd walked out with a band-aid and an attitude. But Caldwell didn't forget. Katie knew he wouldn't, because she'd seen that look before in the eyes of men who understood they'd underestimated their opponent. And she also knew what came next. The reckoning always came next. The escalation started at 6 a.m., methodical as a surgical strike. Dr. Caldwell stood in the hospital administrator's office with Katie's personnel file open on the desk, his voice calm, measured, and lethal in its precision. He'd spent the night documenting everything, not the mass casualty event where she'd saved a boy's life, but the fact that she'd performed it without physician authorization. The words on the formal letter read like an indictment: unauthorized surgical procedure, scope violation, potential danger to patients. He'd already drafted the state board complaint. Already made the call. Katie was still in the documentation room at 6:17 a.m. when her phone buzzed. A text from the charge nurse: come to administration. Now. 3 words. No context. She knew what it meant. The precision with which she'd saved that 16-year-old's life, the textbook field thoracotomy that the arriving trauma surgeon had praised as combat-level surgical competence, had become her evidence of guilt. Caldwell had weaponized her competence into a violation. He turned her gift into a crime. Security was waiting when she arrived. 2 officers she recognized from the parking lot detail, their faces carefully neutral. Officer Martinez, who'd once asked her advice about his daughter's nursing school applications, wouldn't meet her eyes. The second officer, Garcia, held a manila folder with the hospital seal embossed across the front. Her termination papers. Everything about it was sterile, professional, devoid of the raw cruelty of verbal humiliation. This was institutional destruction, and it was somehow worse. We need your badge and access credentials, Ms. Morrison, Garcia said. You are suspended pending investigation into unauthorized medical procedures performed on June 14th. She unhooked the lanyard from her scrubs without resistance. The badge swung like a pendulum as she handed it over, the photo from 3 years ago when she'd still believed she could hide in plain sight as a hospital nurse. The plastic was warm from her body heat. That small detail stuck with her, the warmth of the badge as it left her hands. You can contest this in writing within 14 days, Martinez added, reading from a script he clearly hadn't written. Your union rep can be present for any. I understand, Katie said. Just 2 words. Just absolute clarity. Her voice had dropped half an octave. Whatever softness she'd cultivated in this place had calcified overnight into something else. Something harder. Dr. Caldwell appeared at the end of the corridor as security walked her toward the service exit. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, watching her with the expression of a man who'd just solved a problem. His eyes held recognition now, not respect, not fear, but the cold satisfaction of someone who'd correctly identified a threat and neutralized it. He nodded, small and deliberate, as if they'd reached an understanding. They had. She was leaving. He'd won. She walked past the break room where 3 nurses suddenly became very interested in their coffee. Walked past the public board where her name had been added to the disciplinary list in red ink, suspended, unauthorized practice of medicine. The words were designed to wound, to humiliate, to mark her as incompetent rather than what she actually was. She didn't stop to read them. Didn't need to. She'd read worse. She'd survived worse. But this quiet, methodical dismantling of her civilian identity carried a weight that verbal abuse never had. The ICU was on her way out. Through the window she could see Marcus Chen, the paratrooper she'd given blood for, still unconscious on the ventilator. his chest rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of machines that did the breathing for him. He'd never know it was her who'd pulled him back from the edge. He'd wake to find she was gone, and there would be no explanation, no goodbye, nothing but the absence of the quiet nurse who'd moved through his trauma like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Because she had. At 3 a.m., 6 hours after being escorted from the building like a security threat, Katie stood in the hospital laundry room with her hands full of scrubs. The final load, her white ones, her blue ones, the pair with the small coffee stain on the cuff that she'd been meaning to bleach out. Around her, industrial machines hummed their mechanical song, the smell of sodium hypochlorite so thick it coated her throat. Bleach. Always bleach. That was the smell of hospitals, really. Not the antiseptic they advertised, but bleach. The smell of erasure. She folded the first pair with the same precision she'd learned in basic training. Every corner exactly aligned. Every edge sharp as a knife. This was how you folded a flag, slow, methodical, respectful. This was how you honored something you were about to lose. The scrubs were institutional blue, generic and nameless, but they represented 6 years of her life. 6 years of learning to be someone else, to bury the woman who'd dragged 3 wounded Rangers through 2 kilometers of hostile territory while Ramadi burned around them. She'd traded combat boots for white sneakers. Traded field medicine for hospital protocols. Traded a rank she couldn't use for a title that felt like a cage. The broken dog tag hung against her collarbone, tangled in the fabric of her shirt. She didn't bother untangling it. The chain had snapped during her second tour, shrapnel from an IED that had killed her team leader. The break had been clean. The chain had never been repaired because a repaired chain felt like forgetting, and she wasn't allowed to remember. Not officially. Not with records that existed only in classified files in the Pentagon. Not with a team still alive, still under deep cover, still counting on her silence. But surfacing meant losing them. The State Board inquiry would trigger a background check. A background check would open files. Files would expose the operation. The operation's exposure would compromise 3 operators still embedded across Eastern Europe. 3 people she'd trained with, bled with, nearly died with would die because she couldn't keep lying about who she was. And so she'd chosen this instead. She'd chosen erasure. The last pair of scrubs folded perfectly on top of the stack. She placed them on the counter next to the bleach dispenser and stood there for a moment, hands empty, looking at the uniform she'd shed like old skin. Around her, the machines kept humming their industrial song, indifferent to her presence or absence. They would wash the next batch of scrubs tomorrow. The next nurse would wear them. The work would continue without her. She removed the hospital lanyard she'd still been carrying, habit, muscle memory, and set it on top of the folded scrubs. The badge face down. She walked to the service entrance at the back of the building, the one used by housekeeping and maintenance staff. The door that required a code to exit but never needed one to enter. She'd learned that on her second week. Always know your exit routes. Always plan for extraction. The San Diego night air hit her face like a physical thing, cool and salt-tinged from the Pacific 2 miles away. Rain was coming. She could smell it on the wind, that metallic ozone scent that came before the storm. She stepped out into the darkness without looking back at the building. Without thinking about Marcus Chen waking up to find her gone. Without considering that she'd just surrendered a quiet, stable life, the closest thing to normal she'd ever managed, to protect people who'd never know she'd done it. The broken dog tag caught on her collar as she moved, the sharp edge of the brake pressing against her throat. She could feel it there, a small point of pressure, a constant reminder that some chains were meant to stay broken. That healing sometimes meant staying shattered. She didn't cry. Crying required hope. Crying required believing that this was temporary, that things could be repaired. She was too old for that. She'd learned in Ramadi that some breaks run too deep, that some wounds never close, that the only dignity left sometimes is the composure to walk away from everything you've built without flinching. She walked to her car parked 3 blocks away in the residential neighborhood. Got in. Turned the key. drove east through the rain that had started falling like punctuation marks on the windshield, each drop a period at the end of a sentence she'd never finished writing. 6 hours later, as dawn broke over San Diego and painted the sky in shades of gray, Katie Morrison wasn't a nurse anymore. She was something else again. Something she thought she'd buried in the sand of Ramadi. And in the hospital she'd just left, Dr. Caldwell was already writing his next memo, confident that the problem had been solved, never imagining that the real reckoning was about to walk through his doors in a uniform with medals he couldn't comprehend. Marcus Chen's eyes snapped open to the rhythm of a heart monitor finding its stride, the ventilator's wheeze replaced by his own shallow breathing. 2 days. That's how long the darkness had owned him. His sister sat in the chair beside his bed in full army dress uniform, captain's bars catching the fluorescent light like medals of their own, and when the hospital administrator walked in with Dr. Caldwell trailing behind him like a remora fish, Rebecca's posture didn't shift. But her hand gripped the armrest tighter. The administrator was mid-sentence about discharge timelines when Marcus's eyes fixed on the doorway. A nurse was collecting her final belongings from the locker bay visible through the glass partition, compact movements, military precise, each gesture economical and controlled. He watched her fold a final stethoscope, tuck it into a bag. He tried to sit up. The monitor screamed. His lungs burned like they were remembering fire. Reaper. The word tore from his throat like shrapnel. Horse. Raw. Absolute. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain hammering the parking lot outside. Rebecca's face went the color of bleached bone. She stood. The doctor beside her, the one who would have left David Reyes bleeding out on a gurney, took a single step backward as if Marcus had just detonated something. Major. Rebecca's voice didn't crack, but it carried the weight of someone who'd just seen a ghost walk through a doorway in scrubs. The nurse paused. Didn't turn immediately. Just registered the word with the stillness of someone who hadn't heard their rank spoken aloud in 4 months. When she turned, her eyes met Marcus's across 50 feet of corridor and fluorescent haze. And in that moment, something passed between them, recognition, acknowledgement, the terrible clarity of a secret shared only by the ones who'd seen what needed seeing done. Dr. Caldwell's face transformed. Not shock. Worse. The slow, sinking recognition of a man who'd spent 72 hours systematically destroying someone whose file shouldn't exist. The nurse, Katie, though no one called her that here, continued packing. Didn't acknowledge the hospital administrator's sudden confusion. Didn't acknowledge Caldwell's growing pallor. Just moved through her exit the way she'd moved through every shift, with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd survived things that would break most humans. But that wasn't the worst part for Caldwell. That night, Rodriguez, the IT specialist with marine tattoos visible on his neck when he wore short sleeves, pulled Katie's file. The one that shouldn't exist. He did it quietly, after hours, because he'd seen what Caldwell had tried to do to her and because Rodriguez still carried the muscle memory of watching officers destroy good soldiers for political convenience. The military record materialized on his screen like evidence of a parallel life. Katie Morrison, Major, U.S. Army Special Forces. 2 silver stars. A Distinguished Service Cross. Citations describing her actions on a specific date in Ramadi, Iraq, dragging 3 wounded operators through 2 kilometers of hostile territory while calling in CAS coordinates and providing emergency medical intervention to operators suffering severe hemorrhagic shock, her actions directly resulting in the survival of personnel who would otherwise have been killed in action. His hands trembled. Not from fear. From the understanding that he'd just uncovered proof of what Caldwell had tried to erase. Rodriguez sent the file to the hospital's IT security director. Then he made another copy. Then another. He encrypted them to his personal cloud. He documented Caldwell's attempts to delete the mass casualty event security footage, every keystroke logged, every deletion timestamp recorded. He had everything. And he was already composing the email to the State Medical Board. A Special Forces colonel arrived at Sacred Heart 48 hours later. Not a courtesy visit. Not a social call. Captain Rebecca Jen had filed paperwork, made phone calls, and pulled strings that reached into the Pentagon, and now there was a full-bird colonel in the hospital's administrative conference room, his presence alone enough to make administrative staff straighten their spines. He sat across from the hospital CEO with a file that was itself classified at the secret level, and he spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to moving nations. Major Morrison served under my command in Al-Anbar province. She earned a Distinguished Service Cross for actions on March 14, 2008. 2 Silver Stars for separate engagements in 2007 and 2009. She was recovered from the objective with 3 severely wounded Rangers and 0 fatalities on her watch. Her record was buried for operational security purposes. Those Rangers are still under deep cover on 3 continents. The CEO's face drained of color. Not from the medals. From understanding that the woman he'd allowed to be fired was a federal asset whose termination potentially exposed classified operations. Dr. Caldwell, the colonel continued, reading from a separate file, has a documented pattern of targeting competent medical professionals whose competence threatened his administrative authority. You have records of 6 nurses and residents forced out over 18 months. But Major Morrison is the first with a military record that brings federal attention. Rodriguez arrived 30 minutes later with the digital forensics report. He laid it out like a pathology slide, Caldwell's systematic alterations to Katie's schedule, the unauthorized badge restriction he'd coded into the system himself, the fabricated complaints he'd documented in his own handwriting on hospital letterhead, the false statements he'd made to the state board that contradicted his own emails from 6 weeks prior. The attorney provided to Katie to contest her termination looked at the evidence and quietly switched sides. David Reyes's mother came to the next hospital board meeting with her living son in a wheelchair. He was 17, with a scar running down his chest like a map of his survival, and his mother spoke in accented English with the precision of someone who understood that her words were being recorded. "The woman who saved my son? She was fired. The doctor who would have let him die? He still has a job. This is how hospitals work in America." The local news picked it up. A resident, someone with a conscience and access to the bodycam footage Rodriguez had preserved, leaked the footage from the mass casualty event. News stations ran it on loop, Katie performing a field thoracotomy while Caldwell stood motionless behind her like a monument to his own irrelevance. The caption below read, "Fired Army Major saves teen while doctor watches." It went viral. Reddit exploded. Twitter mobilized. The story became about everything beneath the surface, hidden strength, competence dismissed, heroes working graveyard shifts while administrators collected 6-figure salaries. Caldwell's medical license entered review status. His hospital privileges were suspended. The state board investigation pivoted within hours, focusing not on Katie but on his pattern of credential manipulation, evidence tampering, and systematic targeting of staff who threatened his authority. The hospital CEO, reading the public sentiment and consulting with his legal team about liability exposure, made a colder calculation. He called Caldwell into his office and offered him a choice: resign and face potential criminal charges for evidence tampering, or accept a demotion to non-clinical duties and avoid prosecution. Caldwell accepted the demotion. 6 weeks later, the night shift supervisor at Sacred Heart's main entrance was a man in a security guard uniform checking patient badges and verifying visitor credentials. His expensive shoes had been replaced with regulation black sneakers. His name tag read, "C. Caldwell, Security." He'd worked night entrance for 37 consecutive days without a single person making eye contact during shift change. The hospital had asked for volunteers to cover the position. No one volunteered. It was assigned by seniority, which meant the administrative staff all found themselves suddenly junior to someone who'd worked in the basement archives. 6 months passed like water through a dam. Katie Morrison's office at the San Diego VA hospital occupies a corner with a view toward Camp Pendleton. The walls display her decorations in military shadow boxes, the 2 silver stars catching light like captured stars, the Distinguished Service Cross in its case, the citation letters in their frames. Beside these hang photographs of the operators she'd saved in Ramadi, grainy combat footage showing 3 Rangers moving through a courtyard, alive because she'd made that happen. She runs a combat trauma training program that brings civilian emergency departments through a curriculum she designed herself. 48 hours of intensive instruction on military-specific injuries, emergency surgical interventions, and the kind of composure that comes from understanding that panic kills faster than bullets. The broken dog tag on her neck, the one that's hung there for 7 years beneath her shirt, now has a companion. Marcus Chen, recovered and returned to active duty with 75th Ranger Regiment, had found her at the VA hospital and placed a second tag around her neck during her lunch break. When she asked why, he'd said something that made her hand still. Some chains are meant to stay broken until the right person helps you repair them. The chain is still broken. But she stopped tucking the tags beneath her shirt. They catch the light. They catch people's eyes. The story they tell is her story, and she's done hiding. Sacred Heart's newly appointed medical director, desperate to salvage institutional reputation, invites Katie to conduct a week-long training session. The message is clear: we want you back. We want to show the world we respect competence. Katie accepts on one condition: Dr. Caldwell attends every session. Not as a guest. As a student. She teaches the thoracotomy technique on the first day. The equipment is clinical, the procedure is methodical, and her voice is the kind of calm that comes from having done it while shells screamed overhead. 20 residents sit in the lecture hall. In the back row, a man in civilian clothes, shoes scuffed, eyes forward, face a mask of contained humiliation, takes notes with trembling hands. She doesn't acknowledge him until the final session. A young resident asks how she stays calm under pressure, how she makes the decision to crack a patient's ribs when every protocol and every textbook says wait, call surgery, transfer higher. Katie pauses. Her eyes find Caldwell's in the back row and hold for exactly 3 seconds. You learn what actually matters, she says, her voice dropping an octave, the voice of someone commanding a fire mission under fire. Ego doesn't stop bleeding. Pride doesn't restart hearts. Titles don't mean anything when someone is dying and you're the only one who can save them. Another pause. The silence is the kind that can break careers. True class is what you do when the lights go out. Some people shine. Others just reveal who they always were. The resident physicians applaud. They don't understand the specific target. Caldwell does. He closes his notebook. He stands. He leaves the lecture hall with his shoulders curved inward like a man carrying weight he can't set down. That night he returns to Sacred Heart's night security desk, checking badges under fluorescent lights that buzz like trapped insects. He verifies credentials. He signs in visitors. He watches the staff he once commanded walk past without meeting his eyes. Katie drives home past Camp Pendleton, where a new class of paratroopers learns the combat life-saving techniques she mastered in a war zone that officially never happened. The broken chain around her neck catches the sunset, 2 dog tags now, 1 silver, 1 still waiting for repair. She doesn't bother tucking them beneath her shirt anymore. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in authority, if you've ever known something the world was trying to erase, Katie's story is yours too. Subscribe for more stories about quiet heroes and the moment when the truth walks through the door. Like if you believe competence matters more than credentials. Comment, what would you do if your past caught up with you in public?